This is Reverse Engineered.
Hey everyone, my name is Jon Penland, and Reverse Engineered is brought to you by Kinsta, a premium managed hosting provider. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Giorgia Lupi, partner at Pentagram. Giorgia, welcome to Reverse Engineered.
Hi, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and hi, everybody.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you on the show. So, to get us started, can you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. My name is Giorgia Lupi. I'm Italian, but I live in New York. I moved here 9 years ago, and I define myself as an information designer, and I'm sure we'll get into the definition of that. And I'm a partner at Pentagram, who's a big design agency with offices in London, New York, Berlin, and Austin, where we are 25 partners, practicing designers with a pretty unique structure.
Yeah. So you're a partner at Pentagram and you describe yourself as an information designer. And I want to start by focusing on your professional career, where you're at right now. So can you just tell us a little bit about Pentagram?
Sure. So you might know Pentagram for things that you actually have with yourself and use and see every day, because Pentagram is primarily a branding agency. So designing brand identities, graphic design of many different kinds. And imagine that my partners, way before I joined, designed like visual icons such as the MoMA logo, the Metropolitan Museum of Art logo, logos for products like MasterCard, Shake Shack, Citibank, and I can go on, and environmental graphic and signages for places like the World Trade Center. So really, if you think about it, and that's really all my partners before I joined, visually shaping our culture and our relationship with brands and products. So that is Pentagram, and it's a pretty unique place because every partner is a practicing designer. So we don't have CEOs, CFOs, we're all equal partners, everyone running their own business. And so dealing with their own clients, their own financial issues, sharing over it, and some other resources that we can talk about, and managing our own teams in a way. And we do that because we really feel that it really reflects our conviction that great design cannot happen without passion, and above all, really personal commitment. And so we are committed to make it happen. And 2.5 years ago, I joined Pentagram, bringing the discipline of information design. And so using data as the language to communicate to the broader partnership. So that's in a nutshell, what I'm doing now.
Yeah. So Pentagram, a brand we may not have heard of, but we've definitely seen the work that the organization does, and a bit of a unique structure, as you described, with the partner model, where every partner is actually responsible for producing work and working with clients in an entire sort of profit center unto themselves, or a book of business unto themselves. So let's focus in on what it is that you do then a little bit. Can you describe information design? What does that mean? What does that look like at Pentagram?
Absolutely. So information design is a broader, let's say, way to describe many type of design projects that deal with data, and making data and information, quantitative and qualitative, accessible for many different type of clients. So another way of saying that I do data visualizations, but not only data visualization like the charts that you can see on newspapers and magazine, really sometimes using data even to brand products. I designed, for example, a fashion collection where the patterns that were embroidered and sewed were really representations of data point that could tell stories. So where the brand decided to communicate to their customers through their very product using the language of data. Or have been working with nonprofit organizations such as the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the Gates Foundation, to actually help them communicate to critical stakeholders. And there's a New York siren that we can hear in the background. John, let me know if this is bothering or not.
It's fine, no problem.
It's fine. So I've been working also with nonprofits such as the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the Gates Foundations, helping them communicate with critical stakeholders about data in a compelling way. Where the reason why these organizations sometimes hire us and hire me, and not only work with their internal graphic design department working with data, is really to try and go beyond the bar charts that everybody keeps seeing, and bar charts that are I mean, there's nothing really wrong with that language, but sometimes you really need to make the charts very unique and very unique to the data they represent. And that's why we come to the table. Other things that I've done are murals with data for cultural institutions such as the Museum of Modern Art or the Milan Triennial. So really, like spanning across many different mediums. We've been working on campaigns that are like with data and data visualization. But again, where the visual representation of data is the way that then customers or users or visitors access information.
Yeah, so there are kind of two different directions I want to go in this conversation, and we've touched on both of them. One is thinking about conceptually what it is that you do working with data, visualizing data, telling stories through data. And then the second piece is I do want to talk about your career a little bit, because what you do is really quite unique and interesting. So I want to stick on the career path for just a bit, and then we'll come back to the specific conversation about data visualization in that area. So prior to Pentagram, I know you founded and ran for a while a data visualization company called Accurate. Can you tell us a bit about that company? What does Accurate do, and what's your connection to them today?
Sure. So in 2011, together with other two partners, we founded Accurate. And we were in our, let's say, mid-late 20s. And so as in many cases, when you start working and you start being passionate about a topic, and we all were really intrigued about the potential of data to tell stories, to be really honest, we didn't really have a business plan. We didn't know if we wanted to be a small boutique working on very experimental projects, or if we wanted to grow as a company. But I really feel that at the time, and it was in Italy, Milan, we were really the only company that, besides, I think, probably one or two freelancers, could use data to tell compelling stories. And I just wanted to also just share how I got there. I'm an architect. I have a master in architecture, but I've always been really intrigued by urban mapping and like the discipline of information design to tell stories about geographies and places. And then I get really fascinated about trying to use this language, which is actually abstracting our reality through maps and diagrams, not only to tell geographic stories, but like really to possibly tackle any aspects of our society in a way. And everything started with a collaboration with the main Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, and their Sunday cultural supplement called La Lettura, where a very, I would say, visionary editor at the time said, why don't we open a column where what you guys are doing can be the beginning for a different way to tell stories? And so we had one page every Sunday where we would look for data in cultural topics, like really looking for data on Wikipedia and then matching with other sources, and sometimes even just like really going through books and crafting our data sets, and then use the language of data visualization to help readers get access to the information that we really went through, combining through data sets with a legend to understand, how to build these charts. And so that was really the beginning when we understood that there's potential. Obviously, working with newspapers and magazines don't bring a lot of money, but it got us to the point where we built a portfolio. We built our own way to deal with data. And I think I was really lucky because one of my partners, who I, at the time, who I still really collaborate with, is a sociologist. So we were coming to the language of data not from a statistician point of view or a computer science, but really like thinking about stories and then design. And that really shaped everything that Accurate started doing. People started to see, in Italy what we did. And so bigger clients, such as a few important Italian banks, for example, started to ask us if we were available for hire. And then we said, yes, of course. And then we started to build a team. And so obviously then in the course of the next 10 years, things started to become bigger and the company started to grow, and we needed to figure really out how to grow a company once more. I don't define myself as an entrepreneur, even though I've always been an entrepreneur myself. But I really think that like the interesting thing for me there was designing the company's evolution in a way. So Accurate right now is still up and going. And it's an office with, I think right now they're like 35 people. So, just not a super big company, but also a pretty good scale. And right after we founded Accurate, one of my partners, who also was my partner in life at the time, and I moved to New York for other, like, let's say, personal reasons, and we started to see if we could find American clients for our company. And I really think that we followed our intuition in 2011, 2012. Being at the intersection of design, data, technology felt a compelling place to explore. So that is the beginning of Accurate. Then when I got offered the partnership at Pentagram, I really also made it clear to my partners at Pentagram that having Accurate for me was an asset. And so I still collaborate with people that I actually trained as, let's say, an extended part of my team.
Yeah.
And I know I could speak for hours about this, but like I wanted to give you a chance to ask some questions.
Yeah, well, the story about the newspaper column is really interesting to me from a skill development, career development perspective, because what I feel like I see there's obviously the exposure angle, right? Which is that your work is getting in front of a lot of viewers every single week. But the other value that I see there is sort of this forced repetition, right? Like there was a while. There's a while where I was a freelance writer, and before that I considered myself a writer, but it was purely a matter of I wrote when I felt like writing, or I wrote when I felt like I had something to say. But when I transitioned to freelance writing, which I did for about 3 years, that forced repetition, right? Like I now had to write to make a living.
Yeah.
I grew as a writer tremendously during that period. And so I'm curious how you think about that opportunity. Do you feel like that was a core part of you becoming who you are today, that specific opportunity and the repetitiveness of that task?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, really, you hit a point here. I think, like, first of all, like, we've done it for 2 years. So for 2 years, almost every Sunday, there have been some intervals. Almost every Sunday, we would deliver. Actually, we would deliver that on Thursday because the cycle of the newspaper would be topic approved on Monday, looking for data, visualizing, like really fast paced, and delivering on Thursday. With Thursday night, I remember for that period always been the places where, we would go home, but we knew that there was going to be edits and things to do over time. So it really shaped, I think, the way that we all in the company saw our week cycle. Like, first of all, doing it for 2 years, it's practice. I mean, really, it's like, if you think about like building skills as practicing, that is like a lot of practice forced with external deadlines. And I think the reward of every time I think that the reward kept us going, because every Sunday, really, you would walk in a cafe in Milan or whatever, and you would see people really pouring physically into your visualization. So there was also that part of actually like really seeing people interact with that. And in terms of really building the skills, even more, because in the beginning, to be really honest, we didn't even really know how to ethically address data in a way in which we wouldn't manipulate the story. So we found our way to all of the time be more and more faithful to the data, but also be more transparent of our, say, editorial choices. Then we can get into what I think that data really is, that is not necessarily these objectives true, but is always subject to an interpretation. So I think we also started to build our approach and like my personal vision of data as a, for lack of a better word, storytelling material, more than necessarily like the absolute truth that we need to base our decisions upon. And then really building visual skill set. In the beginning, everything was done manually. So imagine like passing from a spreadsheet that we built to manually positioning elements with, we will use Adobe Illustrator, but really like building our grids. And then we started to figure out how to automate things because, to make it more sustainable over time. So definitely the repetitive part of that, for sure, shaped a lot of what I do now and how I see the world of data in my practice.
Yeah, that sort of forced practice really can't be skipped as a step in the process of becoming truly proficient at something, because you're talking about things like moving from manually positioning data points to automating some of those tasks. And those are the sorts of things that only happen because you get 3 weeks in and you're like, I cannot continue to have this task consume all of my Monday to Thursday. I also have to make money, right?
Yeah, so it's like an optimization process, but I really believe that, especially in how it has been shaping my career for me, it was fundamental to start doing it manually, because then, obviously you find softwares and plugins and scripts that can automate things. But the risk of that, getting to, I mean, this is very specific to my field, but getting to data visualization with a full set of libraries available and tools available without having really spent time manually with your data, I think mentally gets you to shortcuts that are not necessarily the best way to represent data. So one thing is knowing that you would do it like this manually and then you automate it. And another thing is like completely different approach, which I think can be misleading, is, okay, I have this data and I have this set of tools that I can use, let's link it, without passing from what would your brain do, you know?
Right. Yeah. To put it in a different context, the world that I live in, I interact with a lot of software developers or web developers. And the thing that I think of is using a library, like a JavaScript library, rather than learning JavaScript itself. Right. So it's like the difference between learning JavaScript and then progressing to those libraries that make you faster and more proficient, as opposed to skipping forward and not really understanding what's happening under the hood. And you're going to be much more effective in the long term if you take the long path and really understand the nuts and bolts before you move forward to the tools that make you more efficient. So
I totally agree.
Yeah. So eventually you got to a point where you decided to go to Pentagram and to move away a little bit from Accurate, although you're still closely connected and still work with them. But what was your motivation in making that move over to Pentagram?
Yeah, I guess, as many big decisions, I mean, at least for my life, from my experience, as many of the big changes, I mean, it's not that I was planning on it. It's not that I was looking for necessarily a new chapter. But at the same time, I found myself in a moment where I think I was lucky enough where at Accurate, because my partners in business at Accurate now, we started 3 partners and then we became 4. We're a lot focused on the business aspect of it at a certain point, and they really wanted to make it a company. And I think I've been very, very lucky to be the only, let's say, creative director, design director among that. But so the company was pretty self-sufficient. And I think at the point after 8 years, 9 years, I have worked with the designers and now are leading the design teams in the company to a point where really, I don't know if it happened to you, but you feel almost useless. You feel, I'm just amazed by sitting in this meeting and having these people lead. And I kind of feel like the company at that point was more theirs in a way than mine. And I felt that I've already made a place where, I was getting, some visibility for talks and for the philosophy that I called it a humanism behind my work. And I was really intrigued by that part, by exploring, what can data be? And I think I was starting to work on self-initiated projects that would go a little bit beyond the B2B application of data and data visualization, but really using data as a communication tool. And well, being asked to join Pentagram, which if you think about it, is one of the companies that, again, shaped our visual culture. And so really can speak to a broad audience for the type of project they do. When they offered me the partnership right away, I felt that there was really a great opportunity. And also imagine that, we're in a world where all of us as customers know that the brands and the companies we love and use every day are collecting data about us and from us. And I think that really also something that is very compelling to me at Pentagram right now is to being at the intersection of data, design, and brands. Like I'm looking forward to working with brands, and I'm already kind of like experimenting that can really own it and be transparent and say, yes, I'm collecting data from you, customer, but I will give you an experience back through design, through something that can really make you understand, gain insights, figure out where you are. So it really just, felt the right thing to explore. And I think once more, I could make this leap and this jump with a light heart because I knew that Accurate was such in good hands. And also that I wouldn't really chase and cut my connection with Accurate, but I shaped the partnership with Pentagram saying, I really think that there's a value for me to continue collaborating. So that's why.
Yeah, it's interesting. Internally at Kinsta, one of the ideas that we talk about within the executive team is that one of your primary responsibilities as a manager is to sort of hire and train yourself out of your job, right? Like your goal should be to try and replace yourself. Ultimately, the ideal is to get to a point where you do sit in that meeting and go, why am I even here, right? And that can be a difficult place, right? But in a really,
it's scary sometimes.
It can be scary. It can be scary, right? It takes kind of like a a choice to be like, I'm going to choose to be okay with this, right? And recognize that I'm bringing value in different ways, and that my value is no longer simply delivering on these specific responsibilities. So you have a very specialized skill set at this intersection of data, design, and communication. We've talked about this a little bit already, but can you talk to us about the journey that led you to develop this unique combination of abilities and expertise?
Yes, of course. I think it's interesting because when I answer these questions, it's always in retrospect, in hindsight, right? But when you're on the path of the journey, I just, like, once more, to be really honest and transparent, I followed my intuition. I followed my, I mean, one thing that I find misleading is saying that I followed my passion. I really followed my curiosity. I sort of like don't even know what that passion is really, but I really followed what I was curious about and obsessed with, and just tried to pursue more projects of that kind, really developing this practice. I also want to say that there's something that I'm thinking about right now, that, again, in retrospect, I've always been a data collector. There's this anecdote that I remember very vividly from when I was a child, and also my mom keeps telling me that I would spend hours and hours in my grandmother's tailor store. So she was a seamstress, every day reorganizing her like tools such as buttons, threads, ribbons, all of the pieces of fabrics according to rules that I would make up for myself. So by size, by colors, if a button has 2 holes or 4 holes, if a piece of fabric was a certain kind. And I remember that every day I felt that her table was a blank canvas for me to just experiment with ways of organizing and categorizing based on visual properties, which, I mean, it can be kind of like a long stretch to say, but I feel that I've always been so intrigued by the intersection overlapping between rigor and science and logics and rules and visual expression. So I guess that's kind of like the background. And this is also why when I needed to decide what to do for college, at that time, architecture felt the right way to not decide and to just like still have some sort of like scientific boundaries and then also express myself creatively. So until I found that data and this idea of analyzing the world through this lens, one subject at a time, could become something that I could use for work and could become something that can help me produce visuals. I mean, I'm not really answering your question because this is not the developing of my career, but this is the motivation and what really kept me going. And I think that one thing that was also particular when I started doing data visualization, when I started like doing public speaking, was also that we were really only a few women in a predominantly male dominated field in a way, because everything that was tech and data conferences that, even talking about like not so long ago, but 10 years ago, I would be invited to speak at. I mean, really, I found myself being like the 1%. Also, as I moved to the US, I was an immigrant with an accent and everything. And there's something also that felt that I needed to keep going to like make more space for, I don't know, I felt that like really women have a lot to say in a design field, like really also, you know, in a broader like technological data and design field. And I remember when I got the first comments from younger women saying, well, it's amazing that, you know, you can do that. I kind of felt that that was also something that you know, made me keep going in a way.
Yeah. So you kind of look back and you realize you had this early proclivity to thinking about data and visualization and organization of visual elements.
Yes.
And that led you into kind of a personal interest in architecture when you got into college, and you didn't really know what to study, but this is a way to keep pursuing what I'm interested in, right? While earning a degree. And then eventually you find yourself founding a company, and there is this repetitive weekly cadence to putting out this information design. And it sounds like, you know, I'm painting in very broad strokes here because these are the pieces of the story I know. But it sounds like you just sort of stepped through one step at a time and took the next step that makes sense. And again, you've done the same thing here at Pentagram.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't know if you were hoping for a more structured and planned out answer, but that's really what happened. And one step at a time, following what I felt was right to do. But I think also in parallel, like seeing the potential of working in the data field and like thinking about data critically, because I feel that, you know, probably if data wasn't such really a contemporary material or something that felt really like, that we're producing data more and more, I don't know if I would have felt so compelled to just keep exploring. I don't know. I'm
Sure.
fascinated by the potential of this material that like we feel is hovering around us, that we produce every day. And I feel that sometimes, especially working with big companies, I've also found myself on a mission to demystify data and to like help people understand what data really is. And this is something that can sound, as I'm going to say, it's so obvious and banal, but think about the fact that data doesn't exist first. Data is primarily human-made, and even if it comes from a sensor, well, a human being designed the sensor and decided what to collect and what to leave out. And I think that sometimes, companies that just deal with their IT department collecting a bunch of data just start to forget that and be like, oh, we have this data, we need to visualize it. And I'm all the time like, wait a second, so what's the goal? Maybe we should collect different data. And in any case, data is always subject to an interpretation. And I think the more that I started to also develop a philosophy around data, the more I felt that this like taking it a step by step and doing what I felt really compelled to do visually and creatively also had a longer, I would say, breadth in terms of, this can really become something that can help us build a better future in a way. Not that I want to sound like I'm on a grandiose mission. It's just really what keeps me interested.
Sure. Yeah, I think your story, where you're building on your interests and you're working hard and taking the next logical step, I think that's a very normal way for careers to develop. I think the vast majority of people don't start being able to say, this is where I end up. There are some folks who do, like maybe if you want to become a surgeon, right? Like there's a very defined path to get there. Or, a lawyer, there's a very defined path to get there. But for those of us who operate in less easily defined spaces, and even a lawyer, like there are a lot of specializations, and probably the same is true for a surgeon. So probably my example there is not even accurate. I think a lot of folks end up wherever they end up through a series of taking the next logical step. But I do think that a lot of times there might be habits or ideas or practices that help prepare you for the next step. So yeah, are there any habits or practices that you feel prepared you for the next step?
That's really an interesting question. Yes. Personally, I think I also have this curse that can be a good thing and a curse sometimes, that I always want more and I want to explore more. And when I get to a point, I'm like, all right, done. What's the next step? To the point that, even when, I had some like nice opportunities, such as, for example, to give my TED talk, which was something that I was dreaming about. I really remember this like thing that like my ex-husband at the time felt like, Giorgia, you need to stop. Like right after the evening that I gave my TED talk, I was super nervous, done. I was not out yet. We went out to dinner. And then really I looked at him in the eyes, staring and saying, and now what's next? And he's like, really, you just need to stop. Just like enjoy it for a second. So I think in any case, I don't know if it is a habit, it's not a practice, but it's probably something that I have, that I'm really so driven to the next step, to the point that sometimes, it becomes hard to just keep pace with what your mind will want you to do. I also think that, I like working very, very much. And so another habit or practice that I developed is like working on self-initiated projects that I want to explore even besides my clients. And these are because I like this actually serial aspects of producing series of things. These self-initiated projects tend to be painstakingly laborious. So for example, one thing that I started to do and I've done for 1 year is using my personal data every day, every week, and for 1 year to get to know another human being, and like drawing personal data on postcard that we would send across the ocean, where there was no technology involved. And that was, for example, really an experiment around one main question that is like, what is the most human nature of data? How can we remove technology from the equation and get really, really to the very core of what data means in our life if we want to be active about it? So I think, and that was really, really a laborious project that took out pretty much all of my evenings and weekends for one entire year, that also then shaped the next path of my professional paths, because then, people were intrigued by their data, and I started to apply some of the principles that I learned into professional projects. So I think one habit and practice is, if I have an idea that I'm curious about exploring, even if there's not a client or a project at a moment that is demanding me to do it, I'll try to make time. And it's not finding time, it's making time to do it. I think really we get back to the idea that it takes time, it takes work, it takes patience, it takes practice, it takes the time.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing is it does take time, but the other thing I'm hearing is not just doing your specific job, but looking for ways to stretch outside of that in ways that develop new skills, new aptitudes, new opportunities. And so you talked about the TED Talk, you talked about the postcard project, which turned into a book. Dave, do you want to tell our listeners about the book?
Sure. Well, the project is called Your Data. Again, it's the collection of these 52 plus 52, because I got to know another information designer. Her name is Stephanie Pazovek, who lived across the Atlantic. We met at a conference, and we were both talking about this quality of drawing with data as a way to really understand what's in the data and to get closer to the human nature of the numbers themselves. And we just saw, and we had so many similarity, both only children, both expats. She's American and lives in London. I'm Italian and live in New York. And we just felt that we needed to collaborate. But how do you do it if you live across the Atlantic? And we definitely didn't want technology to be involved. And so we came up with this project where we would get to know each other through collecting personal data about weekly shared mundane topics, about the activities we did, the thoughts we have, our apologies, laughters, the sounds around us, really as if in 52 weeks you could paint a portrait of the other person, their surroundings and their habits, and doing it completely manual, when the front of the postcard was the data drawing and the back of the card was the address of the other person and the legend. So how to interpret this drawing. And the book is not only a collection of these 52 endeavors, but it's really also the explanation of what went into the data collection. What are some of the bigger ideas that we got out from this year of labor, which, for example, some of the ideas are that context is as important as the numbers when you work with data. So the qualitative aspect that shape where and how and why that action that you count as data happened is really as important as the number. Or, for example, that data voids, moment that you don't count, are as important as moment as you count. So really, once more, a personal project that made me reflect onto ideas that then are in the book. And also we published a second book, which is because then the project got kind of viral and people started to doing it and started to ask for workshops to learn how to just develop this skill, which felt very approachable. I mean, you didn't need to be a statistician or a computer programmer to start working with data. And so we developed a second book that is called Observe, Collect, Draw, that is sort of like a workbook for learning how to do it in your life and giving you the tools to even use it, either use it as a, let's say, personal practice of observing and reflecting, or as a design skills that in any design project you can use. It was a great collaboration with Stephanie. Stephanie and I are really friends right now. And if you think about it, we got to know each other only through our data, because in that year, no text, no emails were allowed. We only decided the topic and we wouldn't communicate.
That was
so
it.
Again, a very, very radical experiment.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating book. I haven't seen the book, but I've seen a lot of the different screenshots. A lot of it's available, I think at the modern or the Museum of Modern Art. I think they have some of the graphics on the website and whatnot.
Yeah,
and I think
the Museum of Modern Art acquired the collection, so now the postcard, the physical postcards are there, which was sort of like separating yourself from your baby.
For sure.
But it's good.
Some of them were really just very fascinating, and I don't know a better word to describe them than human. Things like how often did you complain and what were the things you complained about, right? Or how many doors did you go through, right? And who opened the door and these types of things. So there are these really just very human data points that really tell you something about you. Like how many times did your boyfriend open the door for you, right? As opposed to how many times did you do it yourself? So one of the things that you talk about a lot, and actually on your website you mention, is this phrase data humanism. And as I saw these postcards, that's sort of the idea that's evoked for me. So you've gone so far as to call yourself on your website an advocate for data humanism. What does that
Yeah.
mean? What does it mean to advocate for data humanism?
It's advocating for, for everybody to really be able to understand what data really is. And also, this is the first time that I'll bring this up in this conversation, but I like to say data are and not data is. I feel that there's something about like thinking about data
Right.
as plural, as a multiplicity of data point that makes us think about data in a different way, as opposed to this entity that is like one of a kind. And data humanism for me means reconnecting numbers to what they stand for, which are always abstracted representations of our lives. As we've seen in Dear Data, anything that becomes on a data set gets collected from our life, our actions, our transactions, our medical records, networks that a human being designed that are connected. So there's always getting back to the handmade and human made. And to me, data humanism is both a premise that I would really want everybody to think about when they start thinking about data, and also a sort of like a vision for a future renaissance where, again, instead of saying data-driven design, we will say design-driven data, because we will design the way that we will collect data to be more faithful to how people understand them, where people can relate to data because they will see themselves in there, as opposed to only see a dry statistic. And if you think about the past year and a half with the COVID-19 pandemic, we passed, I mean, this is a crucial moment in time. I mean, I think advocate not only for data humanism, but for people to learn to speak data, because forgive me for my broken English in saying speak data, but I like it. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we passed from a population where only a few of us cared about data and deeply were, involved with data, to a population where like really maps and charts have been our daily vitamins, with terms like flattening the curve have become colloquial, and you could like really say them to your cousin or everybody. And where we every day used and still are using charts and maps to make critical decisions about how to act in our lives. So I think it's really, really a crucial moment to advocate for people to literally not only understand how to read a chart, but to ask themselves critical questions about how this data have been collected. What is the context? What is the missing part of it? And so data humanism is really just a series of ideas and projects around this premise. So there's that.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding it correctly, and I just want to make sure I do understand it correctly, your thinking about data starts with the recognition that data exists because humans collect it. And that has implications about the way that data was collected. And if we aren't thoughtful about how the data was collected, then we'll be blind to what is missing, and we may be blind to directions that data will lead us that are driven by the collection mechanism or the collection method. Is that reasonable?
It is really reasonable. Me and John, I wish you could be like with me all the time to translate my ideas from a designer point of view to a broader take on that. This is absolutely what it is. And again, once more, I am a designer. I come from a design perspective, and I think developed this idea through projects and through actually really working with data this way. But I really think that, again, it's a moment in time where we need to recognize and always take into account the very nature of data, where things like missing data are as important as data points, but we really don't see them. Imagine the beginning of the pandemic, where we had these charts about hospitalizations and cases, like they were like right now we're understanding how little we knew, how this like curve that we saw, going from March to, I don't know, May, it really probably started in January. We just didn't know it. Why didn't we put this uncertainty there? Why do we design charts that when public see them, they take it as the truth because you say like 52.7, this is the number that I have. We don't know. We didn't know. And only right now we're starting to understand this uncertainty and to actually start to render it in how we represent data. But that should really always be the case when there's this unknown, for example. And again, once more, how the data been collected? Like, what is the sample of the population? These things need to be transparent, and people need to start really just asking themselves these questions before just, blindly believe and trust a chart.
Yeah, yeah. So data humanism does speak to that beginning part of the process where data is being collected and being thoughtful about what that collection mechanism is and what data is missing, and then the second part is the telling the story. And I've seen you describe your profession
Yeah.
as telling stories with data, and I think intuitively
Mhm.
most people think of data as something that can inform a story or that can make a specific point, but that the data is not the story. So what do you mean when you
Um,
say that you're telling stories with data?
I think that's another interesting way of seeing it. I think we have this idea that stories are linear with a beginning to an end, with a character and with a certain development. And so maybe this is how we think about stories. I see data visualization, which is the way that I translate data into stories, let's say, as a potential non-linear way to enter stories, because especially if you can embed context, and every data point that you represent is not only this dry number, but it has, let's say, colors and dimensions that are according to the why, the who,
Mm,
the connection between two data points. I think that graph is in and on itself a fascinating sort of like, even like almost like a visual recap of a book, and it can be an entry
mhm,
point to then discover more. So to me, it's really that it is telling a story. And like my goal with charts that I build is never to have a story that has a beginning of an end, but it's something that I hope will make people curious to know more, to learn more, to go and
yeah.
discover more. So like opening questions. And this is why I think that in any case, we can tell stories with data, but really, even just on the most easy example, think about your data. I mean, we have told each other the stories of our weeks, the stories of our feelings, the stories of our lives for a year through data only. So it's about making sure that you collect data over a certain amount of time, and that you can take into account, again, all of the aspects that make an action, say, all of the time that I pick up my phone, not only an action, but something that tells something about myself, therefore a story.
Yeah. One of the things you've talked a lot about data visualization and kind of compared and contrasted what you do with maybe a more simplistic approach to presenting data in a simple pie chart or something like that. And that's going to be very difficult for listeners to understand without being able to see visually. So one of the things we will make sure to do is include some sort of a link in the show notes to say, go check out some of Georgia's work so you can understand
Yeah,
what it is we're talking about here.
absolutely. In fact, usually I think, I like giving talks because I have like all
Right.
of the visual aids behind me. And when people start seeing it, they really, but I think, yeah, if we can put things on the notes, that'll be great.
Yeah, we'll make sure and have a couple of links, or at least a link somewhere to direct people so that they can see some of these
Yeah.
sorts of visualizations. Go ahead.
But maybe there's something that we can say about, just for the, listeners to picture that. Maybe we can do it right now to say,
Yeah.
imagine that the projects that I'm doing are like, imagine a beautiful pattern, a pattern that can
Hmm.
be a wallpaper, a pattern that can be a pattern, a beautiful pattern that you like on your shirt. It can be a pattern on a packaging. Well, imagine if all of the decisions about the length of a line, the number of lines, the colors, the combination of these elements that you see as a pattern were the representation of a data point. So this is my work. Like
Right.
imagine, like if you need a picture of my work, I think that's a good way to talk about it.
Right. Absolutely. So it's taking, rather than a single metric or a single measurement and trying to represent that simply, it's taking multiple measurements and trying to show them in relationship to each other, which
Yes.
requires a very unique approach each time because it's going to be different every single time because the data is different every single time.
And this is what's really, I think, intriguing for me about my work. Like every single project immerses me on a different world. I learn about the topic and then I see the data. And every time there's this like translation part that needs to
Mm,
make where the translation is different every time. And I think, I mean, I'm really excited about what I do. I'm having a lot of fun.
yeah. What's been your experience around the acceptance of these really unique and rich data visualizations you've created? Do you find that most people get the story you're trying to tell, or are there times where the data are just too complex and viewers struggle to find the story?
Yeah. Um, It's a good point. There's a balance, obviously, between like being like super straightforward and like being denser and richer and create, let not create and render complexity. So there's a few
Hmm.
considerations around that. I think in general, data visualization shouldn't be seen, at least in my perspective, as a simplification of the world, because the world is complex. Our reality is
Mm.
nuanced, rich, and complex. So I see
Yes.
data visualization as giving access to complexity as opposed to dumbing it down. I also think that it really depends on the goal of the project. I always say that if I needed to design for a pilot to land the plane, well, probably I wouldn't require him to read a legend. I will do green, red, just that you need to know community
Right.
decision making. That's the one end of the spectrum. But when you are able to work, for example, in entertainment, like, on a Sunday cultural supplement of a magazine that people will take their time reading
Mm.
on a Sunday, or for a mural in a museum that definitely can tell an important story, but people have the time to really engage with that. And also, for example, in all the interactive experiences that I'm designing, I mean, it really requires people to engage. So when you
Yeah.
have that potential, that opportunity, because of the clients you work with, because of the type of project you work on, I think you can go, and I usually go for denser representations that again can be entry points for people to discover more. I
Mm.
also think that layering is really important. I like to think about my project as, and I really find this thing that I say, where people understand, like a project that I do, a visualization should be compelling both for a Bart Simpson of the world and a Lisa Simpson of the world. So with the
Very
same
nice.
visualization, for how you layer it up,
Mm.
a Bart Simpson of the world might just want to get a quick peek and say, oh, okay, this is what it's about. It's time. There's data point. Cool. I understand. Want to move away. The same piece, I would love for Lisa Simpson to start from the same entry point and then nerd out into details and figuring out the connections and figuring out the little things. So, and because I always put a legend, which is so crucial in my work, that can hopefully really guide people on how to read it. I think to me that's how I see it. And listen, very few things are for everybody. I don't necessarily think that my projects are for everybody. I think I'm lucky that I get like self-selected clients that know that they want to explore with more dense
Mm.
and complex charts if they hire me.
Mm.
And there's definitely value in very simple data visualization, especially for immediate decision-making purposes. But also another thing that I want to say is we as human beings, we were not born knowing how to read a bar chart or how to read a pie
Sure.
chart. Somebody
Mm.
taught us. And I think that if we want to depict the complexity of the world through data, we need to explore with new visual languages that,
Yeah.
can be taught. And not all of the things that I've done will become, as popular as a bar chart or pie chart, but I'm already seeing people starting to enrich the charts with some context. And it's about, educating a population to be more familiar with these languages.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Early on in that answer, you alluded to the idea that the world is complex and that means that data sets and data visualizations will necessarily be complex. And you can look at layering and make sure
Yeah.
that they're understandable to folks who are in different places and looking for different things. But I think there's a very human tendency, maybe not universal, but for a lot of folks to prefer uh, the simple, the straightforward. And I think maybe there's something there about
Mm,
sort of the natural inclination to a bar chart or a pie chart. And I
yeah.
view it as I kind of view it as personally problematic because I do think the world is a deeply complex place. And I think when we try
Well,
to go ahead,
to simplify too much. No, I'm sorry to
yeah.
interrupt you. I mean, I'm really thinking about what you're saying and thinking about, imagine that there's somebody at a company that comes to a designer that designs charts and says, I want a very simple presentation with data that my boss can read in a second and make critical decisions about a company,
Mm.
but I need that like really intuitive. Do we really think that these important people make decisions on their company based on a simple chart? No, they will go and read the 50-page report
Mhm. Yeah.
anyway. Hopefully.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I
right.
think there's like something going on there that
There's
we
a
need to
different
think about.
problem. Right.
Yeah. So again, there's an in between, and
Mm.
I'm not saying that everybody should adopt the dear data approach, but there's an in between, I think, and this is what I would like to strike the
Yeah.
balance in.
Yeah, well, I think what I'm trying to hit at here is that I think it's important not to oversimplify a complex topic. And I think when we oversimplify a complex topic, I watched your TED Talk, and in that TED Talk, you throw up some of the visualizations from the 2016 presidential election in the United
Yeah.
States and how misleading those were. And I think that perhaps is a bit of a symptom of oversimplification of complex data and how it can lead to wrong conclusions.
It is. I also think, absolutely. In that specific case, I also think that the way that we have, and I think we've done a little better, like
Mm-hmm.
it has been a little better in the current, like previous elections, but
Sure.
into 2020 elections. But I think that in that case, when we saw all of these charts right below the ad line, where we had it 82 and 18, like
Right.
these sharp numbers were
Mm-hmm.
alluding to was a level of certainty that was not what was going on. We were still talking about polls. And so in that specific case, it was a simplification for sure, even though there have been outlets such as like 538 that if
Right.
you scroll down and wanted to go deep, you could, and they were really great. But the headlines and the charts with really these two numbers that, because of how they've been rendered the whole time, they felt so certain.
Mm.
And that's what it isn't. I mean, maybe there's some sort of like balance between, saying we think that today the numbers are 82% versus,
Right.
18, but this is the buffer. This is the fuzzy and fluid part in between. So that at least
Mm.
people know that there's a needle to swing.
Right. Right. So as we sort of move towards a conclusion in this conversation, I want to make sure we try and drive this conversation home in a practical direction for our listeners. And I think we can do that by speaking directly to two different groups of listeners. So the first group would be anyone who's in design. So I'm thinking of folks who work at design agencies, or maybe they work in marketing or in design for a specific company. And they're sitting here going, all right, okay, I can get on board with the idea of visualizing data in new ways. What advice would you give them to begin learning about visualizing data in more rich ways?
Yes. So obviously it depends on the context, the goal, the project where you're working. I think in any case, the advice that I would give is when you are presented with data in form of a tab, a spreadsheet, any kind of data points that you're collecting, that you're seeing that are not already in a visual form, just ask yourself, is a bar chart and a pie chart the best way to represent what is in the data? What if, for example, you just started simply to think about data points over time, plotting them and seeing what happens, and seeing, maybe there's some context in this particular moment in time that need to be added. It's not about necessarily producing beautiful charts. It's about
Sure.
understanding that the context that we have around the data collection is as important to be represented as the numbers themselves. And then asking themselves questions about, is this 52, 53, 54.7 very, very sure certain, or do we have, some missing data and gaps there? Represent the missing data points. So I think before even thinking about, let's build a beautiful chart for the sake of building something beautiful, it's really about start to think about the fact that these visual models, such as pie chart, bar charts, the things that you usually use, are there to simplify the job, but maybe there's again an in-between that passes from like really understanding what is in there. And then, to be able to then translate it into visuals, there's a lot that you can just read about information design in general, and then even Gestalt principles of how our brain perceives shapes and quantities and locations. So that's kind of like that matches into design and applying the skill set of a designer to build effective communications and hierarchies with data. And in general, I think that if then we're talking to folks who work at creative agencies and design agencies and they're doing communication projects, I think the advice that I would give is start thinking as data, even small data sets, potentially as a storytelling material. So if you're building a pattern and you're building it for a company that, I don't know, is really focused on building good practices around climate change, I don't know, start to think about incorporating weather temperature data, start to think about data as a tool that you have to enrich every graphic with a meaning. Don't want to say that everybody and every graphics in the world should have data behind it, but it's another way to think about it.
Sure, sure. So it sounds like the first step really is to stop and think more carefully about the data you're trying to visualize, right? Like maybe there is, maybe
Yes,
there isn't a deeper story to tell here, but you'll never know that if you don't stop and think about this data more deeply
absolutely.
rather than starting with the design
Yes,
and working the data into it. Okay. So that's the first group. The
yes.
second group I want to speak to is basically everybody else. So this is folks like myself. I'm not doing design work, but I do consume data
Yeah.
visualizations created by others probably every single day. What would be the takeaway for somebody like myself who's not doing any sort of design work but is consuming data visualization all the time?
For sure. So I think in that case is, well, first of all, try to really like spend a little time understanding the chart, because I feel that sometimes we just like
Sure.
overlook it and we scroll, and a chart is as important as an article. So just like spend some time with that and just ask yourself questions about, what is it you're seeing? What is the source? These data are there, but they're being collected somewhere. So who collected them, first of all? And we're seeing something based on a percentage. What is the percentage about? What is the group of people that this data is talking about? What is the time frame that they've been collected? And the more you just approach a chart with questions, the more I think you will get answers for yourself, because maybe you will look at the sources, or you will understand that, all right, this is a part of reality that this chart is representing, but maybe there's something that it's not representing, and it's okay. But it's better to have data than not to not have data. But it's also good to know that, if we're talking about the positive cases of COVID in New York,
Yeah.
and we're not really talking about the amount of tests that has been done in the same chart,
Mm,
it's just
sure.
incomplete. Which is
Mm,
okay if we don't have the other number, but it's about understanding that still there's something that we don't know there. So I think it's really about asking critical questions, starting from the considerations that these data have been collected by a human being or devices designed by human beings. So
yeah. Yeah.
I guess that's really the biggest
Yeah.
takeaway.
Yeah. So the takeaway for those of us consuming data is really to be aware of this concept of data humanism, where we recognize the human element that went into collecting and presenting and analyzing data. Yeah, great.
Yes.
All right. So as we draw this conversation to a close, I have two wrap-up questions for you. So the first,
Sure.
what is one resource you would recommend to our listeners? It could be a book, a blog, a
Yes.
newsletter, anything.
The Data Visualization Society. It
Okay.
starts with the website, but then, you sign in, and if you're a Slack user, it's a very, very active Slack team, and full of channels with resources. Resources about really, I would say, data literacy, resources about even just really how to read COVID charts, because there's a whole, obviously a bunch of channels that are about COVID. There's a lot of even just channels that are about vintage infographic. And so the starting of the infographic, data art, data as physical manifestations. So I would definitely say, there are books that can help, but like you
Hmm.
will find all of them there. The Data Visualization Society founders, I've been asked to be on the board, so I consult them sometimes. But the founders have been doing really a great job to create that as a repository of everything data and visualization. So Data
Awesome.
Visualization Society. If you Google
Perfect.
that, you'll find it.
Awesome. And then second, where can our
Great.
listeners go to connect with you or to learn more about Pentagram?
Sure. Well, pentagram.com is the website of my company. And if you want to know more about me and my specific work, you can look on the Pentagram website for Giorgia Lupi, or I still have my website where I collect work that is only done by me and my team, which is giorgialupi.com, where Georgia is with an I, Giorgia. And I'm Giorgia Lupi on Instagram, Twitter, all places.
Perfect. Well, Georgia, it's been fantastic to have you on Reverse Engineered. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to hang out with us.
Thank you, John. It was such a great conversation, and I hope that it was inspiring for the listeners. So thanks for having me.
And thank you to our listeners. That's all for today's podcast. You can access the episode show notes at kinsta.com/podcast. That's KINSDA.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Reverse Engineered and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or the platform you're listening on right now. See you next time.